You stand in the square at dawn. The fog hangs low, clinging to the stones like a shroud. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the distant toll of a bell that sounds more like a warning than a prayer. Torches spit and crackle, their smoke curling into the pale sky as the crowd gathers, pressing closer, faces carved with both anticipation and fear. You feel the weight of it, the judgment, the hunger, the unspoken agreement that what is about to unfold is not just punishment, but spectacle. In the center, a woman kneels. Her hair falls wild across her face, her wrists bound so tightly the ropes bite into her skin. Her lips move, but no words come, only the trembling of someone who knows that her fate has already been sealed. Around her, priests murmur in low voices, words slipping like venom into the air. They accuse her of lying with demons, of opening her body to shadows, of seducing men into ruin. She is not called a woman anymore. She is a succubus, a vessel of evil. And you realize, in this place, that accusation alone is enough to end a life. The scene shifts, abrupt, like a blade slicing through thought. You see another woman, not kneeling, but bound to a wooden chair in the center of a darkened hall. Before her lies a table. On it, the severed remains of the man she once loved. The court orders her to eat, to consume what they call his sinful flesh. Her gagging fills the chamber, her body convulsing as the executioner presses the meat to her lips. The crowd does not look away. They lean forward, eyes wide, as if witnessing a ritual of purification instead of cruelty. Another vision. A man, stripped of dignity, stands before his neighbors. His body is forced open to the knives of those who claim authority. Piece by piece, they mutilate him, announcing that each cut is a cleansing, each drop of blood a warning to others who might surrender to desire. His screams do not stop them. His agony becomes the chorus of their judgment. By the time his body collapses, what remains of him is not a man, but a message: lust has a price, and it is flesh. The final image sears itself into your mind before you can look away. A stake stands in the square, and tied to it are not only men and women, but animals, goats, dogs, creatures dragged from barns and homes to burn alongside their human companions. The priests declare them guilty of unnatural sin, their bodies damned by proximity to the condemned. The flames leap high, orange against the gray sky, devouring fur and flesh together. The smell is thick, choking, as innocence and guilt vanish alike into smoke. You want to believe this is legend, that these are whispers of folklore told to frighten children. But the truth is sharper. These punishments were real. These sentences were law. They were written into codes of kings and decrees of courts, carried out beneath the watchful eyes of priests who claimed it was the will of God. And as you stand in the midst of it, watching the fire consume, hearing the screams fade into silence, you realize this is no nightmare. This is history. What you are about to uncover are the darkest, most terrifying realities of medieval sexuality, rituals and punishments so brutal, so unrelenting, that nightmares themselves seem merciful in comparison. Forget romance, knights, and chivalry. Medieval sex was not a story of courtly love, but a system built on terror. Beneath the surface of ballads and painted glass, a different reality held sway, one where the human body itself was a battlefield, and desire was treated as a weapon of the devil. Courts, medicine, and the church did not merely regulate intimacy, they transformed it into a spectacle of fear. Laws prescribed mutilation, exile, or fire for those accused of crossing invisible boundaries. Physicians, cloaked in authority, described desire as a disease of the flesh, a poison that corroded morality and spread like contagion. And priests, wielding scripture as both shield and blade, declared every impulse toward pleasure a temptation engineered by hell. This was no private matter. Sexuality was never left in the shadows, it was dragged into courts, shouted in markets, displayed in punishments designed to humiliate before they destroyed. What should have been moments of human closeness became rituals of suspicion and dread. Marriage was less about love than about surveillance. Virginity was a form of currency, and violation was judged not by the wound it left on a body but by the stain it left on property and reputation. Fear was the architecture of control. Every kiss, every touch, every birth, even the most natural urges of the body, were tied to a structure of rules that threatened ruin for the slightest misstep. The result was not a world of romance, but a labyrinth of terror where intimacy was policed by judges, physicians, and priests alike. And that is the truth hidden beneath the myths. The reality you are about to enter is not strange for the sake of strangeness, but monstrous in its deliberate construction. To understand medieval sexuality is to understand how fear became law, how desire became evidence, and how the most human acts were twisted into crimes against both God and crown. Stay with this story. Because what follows will strip away the illusions of chivalry and reveal the machinery of control that turned the private act of love into the public theater of horror. The church was the architect of the body's prison. It dictated when men and women could touch each other, and more often, when they could not. The calendar of desire was not written by nature, but by priests who transformed the rhythm of human intimacy into a system of bans and prohibitions. Entire months were declared off-limits: no sex during Lent, no sex during Advent, none on feast days, none on Sundays. The holiest days of the year became the darkest hours of surveillance, where even married couples were warned that pleasure risked eternal fire. And the restrictions cut deeper still. A woman's body itself became a mark of impurity. Menstrual blood was seen as poison, a physical sign of sin. A nursing mother was forbidden from intimacy, for priests claimed her milk would sour if she felt desire. After childbirth, couples were ordered to abstain for weeks, sometimes months, until a priest gave permission to return to each other's beds. In these rules, the body was no longer human, it was sacred property under clerical lock and key. Behind every prohibition was the ultimate threat: damnation. The church taught that sin did not end in the bedroom, it followed you beyond death. A single forbidden embrace, a single touch on the wrong day, could echo into eternity, dragging the soul into fire and torment. This was not just about control on earth. It was about control over heaven and hell themselves. And those who confessed their weakness did not escape easily. Penance was not forgiveness, it was punishment stretched into years. Some were sentenced to live on bread and water for decades, until their bodies wasted as proof of obedience. Others were sent into exile, driven from their homes and villages, marked forever as sinners unworthy of community. What should have been private shame became a public brand, seared into memory by humiliation. This was the true machinery of medieval sexuality, not romance, but terror enforced by holy law. Every embrace was shadowed by judgment. Every touch was monitored by an invisible court that extended from the priest's confessional to the throne of God himself. If you are horrified by how far they went to police desire, hit subscribe now. And if you won't, tell me in the comments, why refuse when history this disturbing is right in front of you? But the cruelty of the system was matched only by its hypocrisy. While ordinary men and women were threatened with fire for the smallest touch, the priests who enforced these laws were often the worst offenders. Bishops collected taxes not only on land and trade but even on sin itself. In some regions, priests who kept mistresses were required to pay official fines to their superiors, turning moral corruption into a steady stream of profit for the church. Desire, when committed by the powerful, became revenue. The very institution that branded sexuality as damnable sold indulgence for its own indulgence. And yet, when scandal erupted, it was the faithful who bore the horror. Monasteries, meant to be sanctuaries, often turned into prisons of abuse. Cloistered walls hid affairs, secret children, and acts of violence that were whispered as warning tales across Europe. But these stories were not whispered to expose the guilty, they were told to terrify others into silence. See what happens if you speak, if you resist, if you imagine a world outside holy rule. Fear was not the byproduct, it was the weapon. The most disturbing of all is the story of the Nun of Watton in 12th century England. A child placed in a convent, she grew into adolescence under the crushing weight of vows she had never chosen. When her desire surfaced, when she sought comfort in the arms of a lay brother, it was not seen as human, but as monstrous rebellion. The punishment was not mere expulsion, but ritualized horror. Her lover was seized, castrated, and forced to hand her the severed flesh as a grotesque symbol of her supposed guilt. She, in turn, was locked away, beaten, humiliated in front of her sisters, treated not as a victim but as a living cautionary tale. That story was preserved not as tragedy, but as instruction. It was circulated through clerical texts as a moral lesson, proof of what happens when desire rises against God's order. Imagine being a young nun reading those words, trapped behind stone walls, knowing your body was not yours. That is how the convents were kept silent, not through holiness, but through terror. This was the paradox of medieval faith. The Church preached purity but practiced corruption. It promised salvation while wielding humiliation. And through it all, ordinary women and men were forced to carry the burden of fear, their most private selves chained by the very hands that sinned in secret. And if this feels like a story too disturbing to believe, then ask yourself, how much has really changed? If you're still with me, subscribe now, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. And you won't want to look away when we uncover what came next. Medicine, too, became a weapon. What should have been the science of healing was twisted into the machinery of control. Learned men, cloaked in the authority of reason, declared that conception was impossible without pleasure. This was the infamous two-seed theory, the belief that both man and woman must contribute seed for pregnancy to occur. From that logic came one of the most chilling doctrines of medieval law: if a woman conceived, then it was proof she must have consented. Proof that her body had not resisted. Proof that she was guilty. And so, courtrooms echoed with sentences that silenced women twice, first in the act of violence, and again in the judgment that followed. A girl could stand before a panel of men, trembling, bruised, her body bearing witness. But if her womb carried life, the judges would dismiss her cry. Conception erased the crime. To be pregnant was to be complicit. It was not the attacker who bore shame, but the victim, condemned to live with her violator under the guise of divine justice. Imagine the terror of that verdict, your body proving not your pain, but your supposed consent. And it did not stop at law. The same medical voices that denied women justice also turned their bodies into battlegrounds of superstition. Physicians and priests alike spoke of the wandering womb, a phantom organ said to drift inside the body, choking, suffocating, and driving women mad. Fainting, fits of despair, uncontrollable tears, what we now know as trauma or illness was dismissed as the womb itself, rebelling like a beast within. The cures were as cruel as the diagnosis: burning herbs pressed near the body, suffocating vapors forced under the nose, midwives ordered to coax the womb back into place with brutal treatments that blurred the line between medicine and torture. And through it all, women were told this was science. They were told this was care. But behind the veil of learning was the same truth: control. The same hands that denied their cries in court forced them onto beds of remedy, treating their suffering as proof of weakness, their biology as destiny. What does it mean when medicine itself becomes a nightmare? It means there was no refuge, no sanctuary, no escape, not in the courts, not in the convents, not even in the healer's hands. The very systems meant to protect were built to wound. If this level of injustice makes you angry, subscribe. If you won't, explain in the comments why stories like this don't deserve a platform. Because silence, in any age, is what allows cruelty to survive. And when law and medicine were not enough, humiliation itself was weaponized. In the dim halls of justice, where silence should have preserved dignity, the body was instead dragged into spectacle. Few rituals capture this better than the trials of impotence, known, chillingly, as trial by Congress. Imagine the scene: a marriage unconsummated, an inheritance contested, a wife accused of lying, a husband accused of failure. And so, the court summoned them, not for testimony of words, but for testimony of flesh. Before physicians, clerics, and sometimes even neighbors, a man was ordered to prove his virility. His wife compelled to lie beside him as witnesses judged whether he could perform the act. The chamber became a stage, the marriage bed a courtroom, and the most private act of intimacy turned into a grotesque theater of law. Failure was not simply personal, it was eternal. A verdict of impotence was a scar that never healed. Whispers followed a man through markets and banquets, across villages and kingdoms. To be declared impotent was to lose not only your wife, but your honor, your future, your very masculinity. And women, too, were trapped in the cruel parody, forced to endure exposure, stripped of dignity, branded as barren liars or lustful conspirators. One case echoed across all of Europe, the trial of the Marquis of Gesvres. A nobleman of stature, dragged into court by his wife's accusations, became the unwilling star of Europe's most infamous trial by Congress. Witnesses gathered to watch him stripped of privacy, ordered to prove himself before eyes that judged not just performance, but the very rhythm of his body. His failure, mocked, documented, retold, was immortalized as scandal. Plays were written, pamphlets circulated, taverns buzzed with laughter. A noble name, reduced to a punchline, carried in ridicule from Paris to Rome. But beneath the mockery was something darker. These trials were not just about one man's shame or one woman's truth. They were instruments of power. They reminded the populace that their most intimate secrets were not their own, that the law could strip them bare, body and soul, before a watching crowd. The court became a coliseum, and the accused were gladiators with no armor, no weapon, no chance of triumph. This was justice, twisted into theater. And the audience, hungry for scandal, ensured that humiliation lived on longer than any sentence, longer than any decree. Shame became eternal. If you think humiliation is a punishment worse than chains, tell me in the comments. And if you believe stories like this need to be unearthed, subscribe, because history's cruelties don't vanish when forgotten, they wait, quietly, to be repeated. Sexual sin, as the courts defined it, was not simply punished, it was disfigured. In societies where desire was tightly bound to honor and lineage, adultery was treated as a crime that could not be erased with time or repentance. It demanded a permanent mark, a reminder carved into flesh. Across kingdoms, the sentence for a woman accused of unfaithfulness was mutilation. The nose, that central feature of the face, was sliced away so that no one could mistake her disgrace. Ears were severed, lips cut, sometimes even the soft skin of the cheeks branded with iron. These punishments were not hidden in prison cells, they were done in full view, often on public scaffolds, so that shame was doubled by spectacle. The disfigurement meant no escape. Every glance for the rest of her life was a silent accusation. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons that confirm this brutality. Bones etched with the scars of blades, jaws fractured, cartilage missing where ears had once been. These mute remains whisper the truth of what the written record sometimes tried to soften, that women bore the lifelong terror of laws that turned intimacy into a battlefield. What should have been private love became a source of permanent agony. And men were not spared either. Branding irons pressed into skin, marking them forever with the symbol of their crime. Public whippings in squares where jeering crowds treated pain as entertainment. Pillories locked bodies in place while the community spat, struck, and mocked. Sexual punishment turned into ritual humiliation. The body became both confession and sentence, a living monument to sin. The cruelty was deliberate. It was not only about deterrence, but about reshaping the meaning of sex itself. Where love might once have promised union, the law transformed it into fear. The possibility of punishment hovered over every embrace, every secret glance, every whispered temptation. To touch, to desire, to stray was to risk disfigurement, ruin, and eternal disgrace. Think of the women who carried scars for life because of these laws. Faces destroyed not by disease or accident, but by the cold design of punishment. Lovers who never forgot the sight of a body broken for desire. This is not distant, it is a legacy written into our bones, into the very memory of human intimacy. If you care about truth, subscribe. If not, at least admit in the comments why you're turning away. Even the beasts were not spared. In a world where fear of sin bled into every corner of existence, animals themselves were dragged into the courts, tried and sentenced as though they were willing conspirators in crimes of desire. The logic was brutal, yet chillingly consistent. If adultery, lust, or forbidden acts could stain a human soul, then surely the animal involved must carry guilt too. Records survive of pigs, cows, even donkeys standing trial, their fates decided by magistrates and priests who believed that nature itself could be corrupted by sex. Picture it, a village gathered in the square, not only to see a man or woman condemned, but a trembling pig tied beside them. Witnesses swore that the act had occurred. Clerics pronounced the verdict. And then, execution. Fire consumed flesh, human and animal alike, as though the flames could purify the disorder of desire. The crowd watched with the same awe and terror they would reserve for witches centuries later. These were not isolated spectacles. Medieval Europe alone left behind dozens of accounts where animals were dressed in mock clothing, paraded before the people, and punished as though they had chosen sin. Some were hanged, others burned, others buried alive. It was a ritual of cleansing, a message etched deep into the minds of those who watched. If even a beast could not escape punishment for sex, then what chance did you have? The terror was not just physical, it was psychological. Children grew up witnessing animals they relied on for food and labor slaughtered in fire because of supposed moral crimes. A farmer's cow was no longer just a cow, it could be a vessel of corruption. A donkey in the stable could be an accomplice of sin. The ordinary became monstrous, and the boundary between innocence and guilt dissolved into smoke. By turning animals into co-conspirators, society weaponized fear at its most primal level. It wasn't enough to threaten your own body with mutilation or branding. Now the very creatures that shared your home could be destroyed for your weakness. Sex was transformed into a terror that radiated outward, infecting not just lovers but the world around them. Think about that. Desire had become so dangerous that not even the lowing of a cow or the bray of a donkey could be trusted. This was not just law, it was theater, horror, religion, and control fused into one. A grotesque reminder that no living thing was safe when society sought to police intimacy. And here's the question I leave you with: if the executioner's fire could swallow man and beast alike, what does that say about the depth of human fear? About our need to turn even animals into symbols of shame? If you want these hidden truths of history brought into the light, subscribe now. If you choose silence, then at least write in the comments, why look away, when even the animals had no escape? Homosexuality was not merely condemned, it was hunted. Entire systems of law, surveillance, and punishment were constructed to root it out, to make examples of men whose only crime was desire. In the eyes of the authorities, love itself was treated as treason against God and society. In Venice, those accused of sodomy were led to a fate as cold and merciless as the waters surrounding the city. Drowning pools were prepared, quiet, and efficient. The condemned were bound and dropped into the dark canals at night, the splash swallowed by silence, the city pretending not to hear. Water became a weapon of erasure, no fire, no spectacle, just disappearance. Their names, their bodies, their lives dissolved into the lagoon, as if they had never been. Elsewhere, the punishment was less discreet. In Spain, flames were the instrument. Accused men were tied to stakes and burned alive, their screams rising with the smoke as the crowd gathered to absorb the lesson. These executions were not about individual guilt, they were about terror. Every public burning reinforced the same message: desire outside the sanctioned path would not only ruin you, it would destroy you in the most humiliating, agonizing way possible. But perhaps the most chilling machinery of persecution was in Florence. There, the infamous Office of the Night was created, an institution dedicated solely to policing homosexuality. Spies prowled the streets, informants whispered in secret chambers, and elaborate traps were set to lure men into revealing themselves. The state itself became voyeur, judge, and executioner. Those caught by the office were branded, not just punished in flesh, but marked forever, their very skin carrying the shame. Branding stripped men of anonymity, making their bodies a public warning to others. Once branded, they could not walk the streets without stares, whispers, and threats. Desire had been turned into a scar that could never be erased. This was not chaos, it was organization. Entire bureaucracies and rituals built to transform suspicion into conviction, and conviction into terror. Fear was no longer confined to individuals, it was weaponized against entire communities. Men began to live double lives, shadows within shadows, speaking in code, masking every gesture, every glance. The body itself became a prison, a thing that could betray you at any moment. The cruelty was not just in the punishments, but in the way society forced people to participate in their own destruction. Neighbors reported neighbors. Families disowned sons. Lovers betrayed each other under the weight of interrogation. The office of the night fed on paranoia, and paranoia fed on silence. Think about that. A world where even affection was evidence, where the state could turn your most intimate moment into the rope, the fire, the mark. And here's where I ask you, do you believe these voices deserve to be remembered? The drowned of Venice. The burned of Spain. The branded of Florence. If you do, subscribe now to Tale of History. If you don't, tell me why in the comments. But remember, silence helps the same cruelty repeat. When crisis struck, sexuality became the easiest scapegoat. Disease, famine, disaster, none of these were understood through science. They were interpreted through punishment. And who better to blame than those already marked as unnatural? During the Black Death, as half of Europe withered under the plague, whispers spread faster than infection. They said sodomy had brought God's wrath. The pestilence, the swollen lymph nodes, the bodies piled in carts, these were not signs of biology, but of sin. Entire communities of men were executed, accused of fueling the plague through their forbidden desires. People believed that burning bodies would somehow cleanse the air, that erasing the sodomite would appease a furious God. It was not about evidence, it was about fear. The invisible enemy of disease was given a visible face, and that face was desire. Men who once lived quietly, secretly, were suddenly hunted with a new frenzy. Executions multiplied. Fear became law, and law became massacre. The same pattern can be seen in the downfall of the Knights Templar. These warrior monks had once been the guardians of Christendom, bankers of kings, conquerors in the Holy Land. But when their power threatened rulers, accusations were invented. They were charged not with treason, but with sexual sin, ritual sodomy, obscene kisses, perversions imagined by their enemies. The spectacle of shame was more effective than the sword. With charges of sexual corruption, their wealth was seized, their order dissolved, their leaders burned alive. Desire, real or fabricated, became the most lethal weapon of politics. Again and again, sexuality was framed as the cause of collapse. Failed harvest. Famine. Blame sodomy. Earthquake. Fire. Flood. Blame the impurity of men loving men, or of women defying their prescribed place. People clung to this explanation because it gave suffering a target. If you could blame someone, you could kill someone. And if you could kill someone, maybe you could convince yourself the world was back under control. But this control was an illusion. The plague still spread. The famine still starved. The disasters still came. Yet the bodies of the accused continued to burn, swing, drown, and rot in public squares. Punishment never stopped disease, but it satisfied the hunger for order. History shows us the truth: when fear grips a society, it is always the marginalized who are fed to it first. And so I ask you, do you see the pattern? Do you see how fear transforms into purges, into executions, into silence that lasts for centuries? If you do, then don't just watch, remember. Subscribe to Tale of History, and share this story so these voices are not erased again. Because every time we forget, the same cycle waits in the shadows to repeat. Witchcraft was never only about spells, herbs, or curses. It was about sex. At least, that is what the Inquisitors made it into. When the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487, it did more than codify the witch hunts. It sexualized them. Every accusation dripped with lust. Women were said to copulate with demons, to seduce holy men in their sleep, to drain men of their virility through secret rites. One of the most grotesque beliefs recorded by inquisitors was the theft of penises. Entire nests of severed organs, stolen through magic, were said to be hidden in boxes, hung from trees, or fed like pets. These absurdities were not treated as fantasy, they were treated as law. Murals and woodcuts spread the vision, women harvesting genitals like fruit, cauldrons bubbling with flesh, obscene parodies of childbirth and fertility. This was not satire. It was evidence. Proof that female sexuality, unrestrained and imagined as diabolical, could topple both men and kingdoms. Confessions of these crimes were dragged from women under torture. If she screamed, it was proof she was guilty. If she fainted, it was proof she was guilty. If she confessed, it was proof she was guilty. The circle had no exit. The only way out was death, by fire, by rope, by blade. In this fusion of sexuality and satanic terror, the body itself became the battlefield. A woman's desire was no longer her own, it was rebranded as a covenant with the devil. Her womb, her flesh, her very breath became signs of corruption. And in this way, entire generations were taught to fear the female body. Not as a vessel of life, but as a weapon of ruin. If these stories shake you, don't just watch and leave. Subscribe to Tale of History so these terrifying truths don't vanish. And if you won't, then have the courage to tell us why in the comments. Because silence is the soil where these horrors grow again. The end came not with fire or with torture, but with disease. In 1494, as French troops swept into Italy, something far more insidious marched with them. A sickness without mercy, without precedent. It began with ulcers, with sores, with the slow rotting of flesh. It spread like flame through soldiers, then courtiers, then queens and kings. The world called it the Great Pox. We call it syphilis. For centuries, sexuality had been policed through fear of the invisible, demons, witches, sins whispered in confessionals. But now the terror had a body. A body that stank of decay, that left bone exposed, that ate away at the face until the victim no longer looked human. Lovers turned into lepers. Desire turned into death. The reaction was swift and merciless. Brothels, once tolerated as a necessary evil of the city, were shuttered. Prostitutes were rounded up, beaten, imprisoned, cast out to starve. Those who escaped punishment carried the disease from alley to palace, leaving no class untouched. Marriages cracked under suspicion, entire families dissolved under the weight of betrayal and infection. The careful sexual order that priests, kings, and inquisitors had built for centuries crumbled in less than a decade. Laws that once claimed to protect morality collapsed into chaos, for now the body itself was the enemy. The terror that had once burned women as witches, once hanged men as sodomites, now looked at every kiss, every touch, every breath as a possible death sentence. But fear does not end where law collapses. It lingers. The memory of plague, of witch hunts, of tortured confessions, of bodies rotting in beds, remained etched into Europe's consciousness. It taught generations that desire could not be trusted, that intimacy was always shadowed by danger, that the body itself was treacherous. The collapse of order was not the end of terror, it was its inheritance. A shadow passed from empire to empire, from century to century, shaping how we still speak about sin, about shame, about sex. And if this history unsettles you, if you feel its shadow even now, then don't turn away. Subscribe to Tale of History, and carry these truths with you. Because forgetting them is how fear is born again. So we return to the question that has haunted this journey from beginning to end: what terrified them so deeply? The story of the Middle Ages is not one of prudish silence. It is one of obsession, obsession with desire, with sin, with control. Every law, every sermon, every punishment revealed not purity, but panic. Panic that the human body, left ungoverned, could unravel the world itself. Witchcraft was sexualized, heresy was sexualized, even disease was cast as the punishment for lust. Desire was never simply desire, it was always a doorway to hell, a weakness to be branded, bound, and broken. And cruelty became a weapon of survival, wielded by church and state alike. Torture chambers became confessional booths. Marriage beds became battlegrounds. Flesh itself became an enemy to be conquered. But here lies the darkest truth: what they feared most, they could never destroy. The very act of repressing desire gave it power, twisted it into nightmares, and passed its shadow from generation to generation. Their cruelty was not the absence of sexuality, but its mirror, distorted, monstrous, unrelenting. The Middle Ages, then, were not an age of innocence. They were an age of terror dressed as holiness, where everybody was a battlefield, and every whisper of desire could cost you your life. If this story has shaken you, if it has forced you to look differently at history, and perhaps even at yourself, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to Tale of History. Share these shadows, and let them live in memory, not in silence. Because history's darkest obsessions have a way of returning, when we forget. You've sat through 20 minutes of horror. You've seen how lust was chained, how desire was branded as evil, how bodies were punished until they broke. You've walked through brothels turned to prisons, through courts that feared the human body more than war itself. And yet you're still here. Still watching. Still listening. But here's the truth: this was just one chapter of humanity's darkest obsessions. There are countless more, buried in the shadows of history, waiting to be unearthed. And if you've stayed this far, if you've let these images and words carve themselves into your memory, then you already know you can't look away. I ask you, why wouldn't you subscribe to Tale of History? Why would you turn your back on truths like these, truths that most of the world is too afraid to face? You've already walked this far into the darkness. Don't step out now. Hit subscribe. Keep walking deeper. And if you choose not to, then tell us in the comments. Tell us what stops you. Tell us why silence feels safer than truth. Because history's horrors do not fade when ignored, they only wait. And they are waiting still.